All right, guys, we are at a point in the curriculum, right at the 20th century, where it looks like the West has won, that the industrial powers of Europe, the United States, and others have, in a lot of ways, seized power across the globe, and it's their vision of the world that's being implemented. But there are rumblings underneath that need to be fleshed out. Okay? And those things, when they finally bubble up to the surface, will cause an event that will bring about regret, frustration, and a whole lot of death. So we're going to go and take a look at this in today's discussion. But first of all, some context as to what's going on in Europe in what is known as the long 19th century, between around 1750 to 1914. And a lot of this has to do with the French Revolution, not just the ideas that pop up, the application of the Enlightenment and others, but then also Napoleon's conquest of most of Europe. And thus, as a response, as a result of this, the ideas of the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, are crossing oceans and going around the world. Now, there are those who say, no, enough is enough. Hey, we can't have these revolutionary ideas take hold in our states. And that, particularly many of the peacemakers, the traditional monarchs of Europe, aim to, as best they can, as they came together after the first defeat of Napoleon in 1814, to one, restore the monarchy. So, despite all the trouble that France has caused European states in the past 20 years, um, their aim was to restore the French monarch, almost as if nothing had happened. They're going to establish a constitutional monarchy. So, again, to give the revolution some sense of achievement, but yet to try to restore the traditional line of hereditary monarchs. Not only that, but to prevent another Napoleon from happening. And so, as an aim to do this, they would create alliances with one another. In fact, they're going to call this the balance of power, such that no one group, not France, not the new state of Germany, would have exceeding power over the other European states. If that ever does happen, the others would join together such that both sides of a particular conflict would be equal in a sense. Okay? So a balance of powers. Okay? But they're dealing with some issues. Okay, we'll get to that in a bit in terms of suppressing revolution, both from revolutionaries in terms of liberalism and democratic ideals, but then also working class revolutions, nationalist revolutions as well. So we have instances of uprisings that were actually relatively successful, like the independence of Belgium and the gaining of constitutional rights in France. But when this occurs in other places, like in Prussia, Ireland, Poland, Italy, Hungary, and others, they would encounter some failure. So with that, hey, we want to take a look at some of these historical processes or some of these forces that are changing the world at this time here. So for the first part of your written response, go into Google Classroom, the Google Doc that's provided there, and your textbooks, page 703 to 704. Okay, and then go and answer these three questions on the pan movements. Okay, so go ahead and pause the video right now. Go and do that from your textbooks. All right, hopefully you've come back and you've examined these a pan, in other words, multinational cross-border movements. And on one hand, you have ideas that are now crossing traditional boundaries. And one way for that to actually occur is to use the creation of and to create an identity for yourself here. An example of this would be in regards to Germany, which, if we go back into history, the all the various kingdoms, principalities that make up what is known as the Holy Roman Empire, one particular region, particularly Prussia right here, will end up conquering, whether by military force, diplomacy, and others, to form a greater Prussian state, which they're going to use to create the foundation of Germany. And they're going to create a new identity for themselves based upon a number of things. Even though there are a number of Catholics in country, they're going to utilize Protestantism and the Protestant faith as a means to generate the sense of unity. Folklore, for instance, we've all heard of these traditional fairy tales, right? From the tales of the Brothers Grimm, right? To have notion that children are going to grow up with the same stories, the same moral code would be utilized as well. A similar language, not only that, but the writing of history would be utilized to create a national identity. Okay, and why this class is important because we're trying to build up, in a lot of ways, this notion of a national history, a national identity. And for us here in our class, isn't to build that per se, but to actually be able to process all of these things to say, like, look, what about this? What am I being taught? And what underlying message is being sent in these places here. Okay. Now, times were ripe for Germany in terms of declaring independence. The growth of the Industrial Revolution and free trade, and some state-sponsored industrialization occurred in Germany as well to make Germany one of the foremost industrial powers. It had the size and also the natural resources to be able to handle this. And not only that, but they had smart governors, smart bureaucrats, the most famous of which is Otto von Bismarck, who becomes one of the chief advisors to the Prussian king. And he sets about a policy, what he called blood and iron, which means not only industrialization, but then also invasion of neighbors as well, to take land and to seize land as well. And so in wars in 1866 against Austria, he was able to take some land from them, and more importantly, a war against France in 1871 that ends up seizing some borderlands known as the Alsace-Lorraine. And in doing so, France is going to remember this, okay, feeling as if there are French citizens, okay, across in someone else's border. So they're going to remember this, and it's going to lead France to be much more um, apt to go to war to try to recover that land and property. Italy has a similar story in the creation of a unified vision for Italy coming from Giuseppe Mazzini, who, and amongst others, urged for the unification of Italy, which had been controlled by numbers of foreign states in the past, whether it's France, Austria, Spain, and others, to create this new identity based upon a shared geographic history. And through the work of Mancini, the Kingdom of Piedmont Sardinia, and Giuseppe Garibaldi, the unification of these number of states would create the pan-Italian state. Okay? But not only that, it's not just simply a national identity. Sometimes it's an ethnic identity that goes beyond states. And what you read about in terms of pan-Slavism, particularly under the leadership of the biggest empire in Afro-Eurasia, Russia, is going to play a role, and particularly Russia in terms of its meddling in the Balkans, saying, look, these are our people. We are there to protect them. They are the same ethnic identity, same religious identity in terms of Eastern Orthodoxy. And so Russia is going to play a role in the politics of Eastern Europe. Okay. All the while, though, many of the old multinational empires, so in other words, the traditional mold of the empire made up of dozens of different ethnic and national identities, the most prevalent of which being the Austro-Hungarian Empire, led by a monarchical um, reign of the Habsburg dynasty, is losing land and losing ground. For instance, there's the loss of land in against Germany and also against Italy as well. And to try to recover some territories, Austria-Hungary is actually going to move against, as it turns out, another failing multinational empire, and that would be the Ottomans, which we looked at in previous lectures. So the Austro-Hungarians are going to start to, if not support, but at least move further south, and they themselves are going to help in terms of the formation of Romania, Bulgaria, and so forth. So they're moving further south into the Balkans as well. All the while, like we've discussed before, the Ottoman Empire is losing ground both in Tunisia, in Egypt, in this case here, the Italians, in this case here, to the British, and so forth. And so they are retreating back to their core in Turkey. And not only that, but again, all of these nationalist movements here, the creation of Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, and particularly Serbia, is going to result in the Ottomans losing most of their European empire by the 20th century. Okay? All the while, so again, you have all of this unrest that's bubbling underneath the surface here, and that includes, with the Industrial Revolution, an entire new class, okay? The proletariat, the working class, who are now frustrated with the governments, any government as a whole. And think of this as um, a a movement that's going on in almost every single industrial state or even proto-industrial state. The working class, frustrated with their working conditions, the dangers, the low pay, the awful working conditions in the cities, and all it takes is something drastic for them to perhaps come together. There's talk about an international, we talk about a pan movement, but international workers' movement as well. Okay? And to add to this, you have all of the empires across the world, whereby now there's imperial unrest, the push for independence in many of these colonies because look, they're being treated like second-class citizens and so forth. And so there's now the push by these places to declare independence. But perhaps you can make an argument that all is good. These things can be fixed if there's just a bit of um, rational thought and knowledge. Okay, so with that, just as a quick review in terms of the context of what we're entering into as we go to the 20th century, review a little bit what the Enlightenment is and the achievements of the Industrial Revolution. So go and answers number 4 and 5 right now as you pause the video. Okay, you should be back. And hopefully what you got is what a lot of at the turn of the 20th century, at the turn of the century, what a lot of Westerners were thinking. I mean, check out, we've got the best government possible. We've got all the advances of the Industrial Revolution. The Enlightenment allows us to look at the world with reason and logic and not, religious dogma or we're just making things up. Okay? We're not guessing on things here, but instead it's science, it's culture. Like, and in a lot of ways, many Westerners will look in the mirror and say, look at what we've done. We've created a world whereby more people are living more comfortably than ever before. But what we get to in what becomes known as the First World War, or what the Europeans call the Great War, is the crisis in the imperial order. So we're going to take a look at the cause of the First World War, or particularly the cause of World War One. And so now this is one of those wars where uh, it's not as simple to explain as this country was aggressively attacking another and then it started this entire war. The fact that we have to look at these, what we call historical processes, in order to understand what's going on in this world, is what makes it oh so more tragic. In that the causes themselves were so vague, and they're not tangible reasons, concrete reasons we can hold on to. And so when we look at the causes of the Great War, there's a number of different possibilities in terms of why this war occurred here. The first of which is industrialization. And think about now how war has changed in regards to industrialization, not just making more and more goods and having more and more resources than ever before, but that somehow industrialization will multiply the ability for a state to go ahead and produce a long-standing conflict. Okay. Secondly, we want to take a look at the role of nationalism in regards to the outbreak of war. So think about this for a second in terms of how nationalism might result in outbreak of a war. Okay. Whether they could be uprisings in particular locations, people demanding we want to be our own independent state, and in others coming in perhaps, to help to resolve the issue. That's going to be an issue. So we're going to take a look at that in a bit here. Thirdly, there are the various plans for war as well. The Germans had this plan created by one of their army chief of staffs. This is called the Schlieffen Plan. And the Schlieffen Plan basically says this: let's go ahead and instead of attacking France directly into France, because that's where all their armies are going to be, we're just going to declare war on Belgium, and we're going to go around the French army, because that's what they did in the previous war against France. France has its own plan and so forth here. But either way, all the countries, all the major European states, all have this plan for war, because now you're dealing with trying to call millions of people to go and fight. Hey, you guys going to school every morning just to get 5,000 people to Franklin High School is a mess every morning at around 8 a.m. And it's a mess around 3 p.m. when people are there for pickup, right? How then do you move? Hey, we're not even talking about thousands, but millions of people from dozens of locations across your country to a general front. And the way that you have to do this is by railroad, and you have to plan every bit of this. The problem is, and what the French found out in the Franco-Prussian War, which they lost in 1871, was that if you don't get enough troops to the front in time, you're going to lose the war. Doesn't matter how brave you are, doesn't matter how many men you have, you're going to be outnumbered if you can't get these people to train fast enough. Not only that, but everyone's plans for these war was offensive. So if you take a look at this image here, right, the thing about war is that you're to attack. That's just the plan of the age and that particular day. Okay? And that involves, breaking through an enemy line and from there setting in the cavalry. But if you look at the types of weapons that have been developed by the 20th century, if you're a man riding on a horse, no matter how fast you make the horse run, you're still an enormous target for the Maxim guns and repeating rifles of these new armies. And they're not just a few hundred men, they're not just a few thousand men. In fact, we're talking now about millions, many of which are trained with the notion that what they're doing is right. And not only that, but that any war would be a glorious occasion. It'd be an honor to fight for your country. What we call militarism, whereby you're going to glorify military power. This is the age of military parades. Let's just parade them down the street just to see, how amazing our armies are and how they will always go undefeated in battle. And so you have these enormous drafted armies, just like in the mold of Napoleon, but now they're even bigger. They have 4 to 5 million strong, and even those that don't have these large armies may have a small professional army and a very expensive battleship navy. Okay? So again, all of this is coming to be, and all the while, you have international competition. And so think about, on one hand, the move for territory across the globe and what happens when one of these is up for grabs. And probably one of the most famous instances early 20th century was when the region of Morocco was in flux. Spain was losing control over this particular colony. And then you have two groups, one particularly France, which is close by, and France already has Algeria. And the other one is a country that is just seeking as many colonies that are left over. In that case, that would be Germany. And so these two states nearly went to war as a result of Morocco. So instead of, we'll see later on, instead of Serbia being that infamous country where this war begins, it might have been a North African one. So that was a close call. And so, we looked at Morocco before, 1905. And then finally, that balance of powers, whereby you have two groups that are poised for war at any time to try to sustain this balance of powers. What it resulted in were two different alliance sets. Germany, Austria Hungary, and Italy being what are known as the Triple Alliance. Eventually, Italy backs out here, and this would just simply becomes the Central Powers. And then you have the Triple Entente, which will become the Western Allies, Britain and France, and Russia. I mean, do keep in mind that, again, these are strange alliances. About 50 years prior to this, France and Britain and the Ottoman Empire were actually fighting against Russia in the Crimean War. So again, these aren't there because of similar ideologies. These are, in other ways, alliances of convenience. Okay? While it may hope to keep a war from happening, think about all of the rest of those historical processes leading up to this point here. Okay? The open competition of colonies, the race for industrial networks and resources and markets, the notion of militarism that everyone feels like if they enter into a war, they're going to win all of this here. So in a lot of ways, it makes the balance of powers obsolete. And instead of preventing a war, it may just be that if there is just a small little regional conflict, it's going to, instead of making this just simply between the two combatants, instead it's going to drag everybody into the mess here. So everybody comes into the picture and into the war here. And this is particularly true in an early conflict when Germany goes to Austria and gives them what many call a blank check. So, in other words, we give you unconditional support. Do as you will. We will be there to back you up and support you. And as a result of this, Europe will be, check out this acronym, in pain. Or in other words, Europe by 1914 looks something like this. Okay, so with that, go ahead and do a quick review as to now what we've just discussed here. So identify one of the historical processes that we've just discussed that caused the Great War and make an explanation. So usually this is one question that's combined together, but I want to split them in two to make sure you have a thorough response and a thorough answer for one of these historical processes that we've just discussed in the lecture. Okay. And we talk about historical consequence. Okay, so what happens as a result of all of these ideas is that war does happen. And all it takes in a lot of ways is a spark. Here's this imagery of a barrel of gunpowder here. Okay, and all it takes to get this entire thing to go off is just simply just a little bit of fire, just one little spark here, okay, that will lead to the rest. Okay, and where that spark happens to be in the volatile Balkans region, okay, particularly with this country here called Serbia. Okay, and Serbia is in a delicate place here. It was declared independence in 1878, splitting from the Ottoman Empire, and again, getting aid particularly from Russia, okay, in doing so. Um, and while Serbia is declaring independence, Austria takes this moment to go and take a neighbor country called Bosnia, in this case here. Okay. The Serbians will go ahead and fight a war against the Ottoman Empire and others in 1912 and 1913, and aid in the independence of some of these other countries, Romania and others, away from the Ottoman Empire. And not only that, will try to eventually seize an empire on their own. So Serbia has a hope that they will become the pan-Slavic state, in the entire Balkan region. So they want to unify all of this for themselves, and particularly they are going to set their sights on their neighbors here, which is Bosnia. Okay? And Bosnia will become a uh, a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It's multi-ethnic, it's diverse, so it's not just simply Christian Slavs that are here. There are Muslims and dozens of other ethnic groups here. Okay, but okay, a one particular organization called the Black Hand, okay, basically a terrorist group,